I've been reviewing Metroid games, so I figured I'd just go ahead and make a list of which ones I prefer from best to worst. Samus Returns being omitted because I haven't really played it yet. Don't get me wrong, I've seen it and it looks very good, but I've never got around to acquiring it, so I don't think I can give it a fair take at the moment. I'm also omitting Metroid Prime Pinball because as much as I love it, I can't compare it to other entries because it's great for different reasons and isn't exactly a good Metroid game, as it were.
Number 9.
Perhaps a surprise to absolutely nobody, Other M is the weakest of the Metroid games on this list. As I said in my review, it's not the worst game ever and I got some enjoyment out of it, but its many faults are ultimately too much for me to ignore. Pretty graphics just won't save the bad writing, aggressive linearity, annoying pixel hunts, bad controls, and stolen Metroid fusion elements from mediocrity.
Number 8.
Now we're getting into the not-so-bad category. Since another Metroid 2 remake isn't an official Metroid game, I can't include it here, although for the record I'd place that as 4th best if I did, wink wink, so I'm just gonna judge the original. While it added many great things to the franchise over the first Metroid, such as the ability to crouch shoot and shoot down, in addition to creating new designs for things that were previously color swapped, it hasn't really aged all that well. It's fairly linear and it's before they finally tuned the controls with Super Metroid, so it still feels a little stiff if you go back and play it. Seriously though, go play AM2R if you want your Metroid 2 fix, wink wink, or you could just get Samus Returns.
Number 7.
Another one that probably isn't a big surprise that was included so low on the list. My opinion of it has softened up over time, and it has a decent enough variety in the single-player environments that it's not too bad, but it was clearly made with multiplayer in mind. It's basically like if Quake 3 was given a story mode, basically. You get new items, but they're just new beams. Everything else you can get is already given to you from the start. The bounty hunters are decent to fight, but aside from the final boss, it's just the same 2 bosses over and over again, with minor improvements. Since the DS servers are down, it's lost its ace, the online multiplayer, so maybe you should try to find it in the bargain bin if you really want it.
Number 6.
Now we're starting to get into the pretty good category. The linearity and plot exposition can be a little annoying if you just want to get into it and play a more traditional Metroid game, but the actual mechanics are as solid as you would expect, and the SAX plot where Samus feels legitimately weak is very good. Getting the plasma beam, where in my opinion the game shifts from cautious survival to just dominating, is incredibly satisfying. It's probably no coincidence that the plasma beam is what finally gives Samus the option to harm SAX. At the time, before Other M lazily recycled it, the stuff about the Galactic Federation not being as benevolent as initially expected was quite a development, and it's still very much Metroid, just a Metroid where doors lock behind you when you enter a sector.
Number 5.
I'm sure I'm going to get at least a few people foaming at the mouth because I didn't place this higher on the list, but this is just my own personal opinion. Super Metroid is truly when Metroid started coming out on its own, and the better of the later Metroid games owe it for setting out a very clear blueprint for them. The refined controls still feel good going back to, and it's probably the most isolated feeling you'll ever get from any of the Metroid games. The reason I don't place it higher is because I simply think the games after this have further refined things. Make no mistake, this is perhaps the second most important Metroid game in the series, second only to the original on the NES.
Number 4.
Speaking of the original Metroid, I opted not to put it on the list because it hasn't aged really well in my opinion. Also, I haven't played a very large amount of it, so I'll instead talk about Metroid Zero Mission. I place it above Super Metroid because I think the faster movement and other refinements such as being able to grab ledges and having better controls for things like space jumps just feel overall better to me. Super Metroid may feel more isolated, but Zero Mission simply gave me more enjoyment overall. My one real gripe is the often mandatory Chozo statues. If you don't feel like sequence breaking, they can be impossible to get around without simply playing ball, as it were. I actually enjoyed the Zero Suit tone shift because the feeling of vulnerability carries over well from Metroid Fusion, and just like it, obtaining the plasma beam, along with the rest of your stuff, really shifts the game and makes you feel very powerful.
Number 3.
I know it may seem a little weird, but I actually prefer Metroid in first person. Now don't get me wrong, I love playing it in side-scroller, especially AM2R, but I think the first-person angle really gives it a unique feeling, especially since it's the only series I've seen that can truly pull off Metroidvania in 3D, let alone first person, as well as it does. Prime 3 in particular benefits from very tight controls and very emotional moments. I reviewed it, so I suggest checking it out if you want to hear my full thoughts on that.
Number 2.
As the game that brought the series into 3D, Metroid Prime is a true masterpiece and a blast to play to this day. Among the best graphics on the GameCube, combined with a control scheme that can best be described as Zelda in first person that feels good enough to use. It heavily encourages you to lock onto enemies to compensate, so enemies kind of feel more like puzzles in a way than traditional fights, especially the boss fights. Unfortunately, the artifact hunt somewhat holds it back in my opinion, but it's definitely earned its reputation overall, and I would heavily recommend giving it a look if you haven't already.
Number 1.
I'm probably alone in thinking this, but I honestly think Metroid Prime 2 Echoes is my favorite Metroid game I've played so far. While the controls aren't nearly as good as Metroid Prime 3 since it's stuck with the GameCube controller, I absolutely adore the dynamic of going from light to dark, and while a couple of bosses are annoying, it also has among my favorites in the series, especially Quadraxis. It also introduces Dark Samus, and while SAX felt more intimidating at first, Dark Samus feels more like your dark twin who is improving alongside you since she has more abilities each time you fight her in order to match your own growth. Sure, there's a key hunt at the end, but I really don't mind it as much as the artifact hunt in Metroid Prime 1, and it has some really dark twists like Galactic Federation soldiers being co-opted as dark parasite puppet zombies. I absolutely recommend it if you like a little dark grimness with your Metroid, and it was my favorite so far. And that's it for this list. I know it's probably a very unusual selection, but hey, that's just personal opinion for you. Metroid Prime 1, Super Metroid, and the original Metroid will always be the most influential entries in the series, but for some reason I just like Metroid Prime 2 more. Maybe I'm just a sucker for the darker, grimmer entries because I also favored Majora's Mask over Ocarina of Time, but that's a story for another day. It was truly difficult coming up with this list because I absolutely love Metroid and each one of them gave me enjoyment as I played them. I hope you enjoyed this list and I'll see you next time, and here's hoping Metroid Prime 4 is another win.